Chapter 9. Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Howard Becker was a brilliant physicist. My father knew him fairly well because they sometimes worked together on projects at General Electric, where Howard was awarded a slew of patents for inventions ranging from aircraft components to improvements in home appliances. Howard's wife Helen was buddies with my mother, and they gabbed on the phone a lot and met once in a while for lunch. Their son David went to engineering school with me, and although we weren't close friends, whenever we saw each other on campus, we'd stop and talk for a few minutes. The Beckers lived only 15 minutes from us, but unlike our Coen brothers' Serious Man neighborhood, the Beckers lived on a beautiful and isolated tract of land that's near the current site of Louisville's Parklands, the linear park and bicycle path that Jerry Abramson, Mitch McConnell, and Humana's David Jones all had a hand in developing. Even today, the Beckers' old house sits in seclusion at the end of a long gated driveway in the woods off a winding rural road. Because of its isolation, Howard rigged an ingenious series of sensors using 1970s technology that alerted him if anyone approached his house. But in the early evening of Monday, June 25, 1979, David Becker called the police to report that he'd arrived home to discover that his father, his mother, and his niece Erica were all dead. They'd been shot to death. Naturally, we were all shocked when we heard the news. We were even more shocked when David was charged with their murders. I have to warn you that many of the paragraphs in this chapter are going to be disturbing to read. Not all of them, but many of them. They were certainly disturbing to write, and the events they describe were even more disturbing to experience. But I have to write about them. I have no choice. The experiences were too powerful to ignore here. If you're not in the mood to read about sad, depressing, and disturbing events, I don't blame you. Maybe you ought to skip ahead to the next chapter, The Gumball Machine. You won't find anything disturbing there. In fact, I've included that chapter as an antidote for what I have to write about now. When the police charged David Becker with murder, they claimed that his mother had caught him in the act of raping his niece, Erica. When his mother tried to intervene, the police said, David grabbed his father's rifle and shot his mother in the face. Naturally, his father also tried to intervene, the police said, and then David shot him multiple times. Finally, he murdered his niece. The little 9-year-old girl was shot in the head and in the heart. I'm not going to describe in detail the condition of the bodies when they were found, even though we heard a lot about it. Those details are simply too gruesome. But it's important to note that when a human being is shot, they don't just clutch their chests and keel over like some bad guy in an old Errol Flynn Western. Gunshot victims' blood and brains and guts are scattered everywhere. Guns do gruesome, horrific things to people's bodies. And sweeping up a mass of the coagulated blood of a dead relative and flushing it down a toilet is gruesome and horrific as well. The Becker case became something of a sensation in Louisville, and it was widely covered by the press. I have a powerful memory of seeing David on local TV news, being led in chains to his parents' funeral. My mother was there, and she said that it was a bizarre and bewildering spectacle. None of us, including David's family, could believe that David was capable of committing such heinous acts. His sisters sold the family home and borrowed huge sums of money to fund his criminal defense. At his highly publicized trial the following year, David was acquitted due to conflicting evidence and a botched police investigation. There was a second gun, the police discovered later, but they couldn't find it. No one else was ever charged in the case, and almost a half-century later, the murders remain something of a mystery. If the Beckers were the only victims of gun violence I've ever known, perhaps I wouldn't be writing these paragraphs, and perhaps my hatred of guns wouldn't run as deep as it does. But I hate guns. I hate them passionately. I hate them because of what I've seen them do to some of the people I've been very close to. The first of them, who I knew long before the Beckers died, was a woman named Betty Yates. Like Helen Becker, Betty was a good friend of my mother's. Betty had a wonderful, sunny disposition, and she was a lot of fun to be around. She came often to our house. I was just a little kid when I first got to know Betty, and so I always accepted her as she was, a woman who had a great deal of difficulty speaking. Long before I was old enough to know about such things, Betty's idiot husband shot her in a fit of rage, and then he shot himself. He died. Betty spent the rest of her life learning how to speak again. Who painted that picture? Tyler asked me at a party about a portrait of a young Nepalese girl that I'd recently hung in the living room of our little Highlands house. It was the same room where his mayoral campaign had held its first meeting 13 years earlier. My friend Ava painted that, I told him. She was Dutch. She died a long time ago. And then I proceeded to tell Tyler her story. Poor guy, his innocent question prompted an answer that gave him far more information than he'd bargained for. But when he asked me that question, Ava's story just poured out of me. I hadn't told it to anyone in a very long time. In late 1980, when I was working on missiles for McDonnell Douglas in St. Louis, I rented a house in St. Charles, Missouri, a few blocks from the Missouri River. The male half of the couple next door was a guy named John, and he was a civil engineer. While he was working on a project in Nepal, he'd met a girl named Ava Abels from Nijmegen, the Netherlands. She was something of a free spirit, and she loved to roam the earth. It wasn't traveling that Ava did, it was roaming. She'd been almost everywhere, and she told me more than once that her favorite place on earth was Nepal. Kathmandu. Whenever she told me that, I resolved to go there, but I never did. When Ava discovered that she was pregnant, she and John decided to return to his hometown of St. Charles to settle down and start a family. By the time I got to know them, they had a son, Brahm, who was around 2 years old. I always found John to be a bit of an oddball, and sometimes I felt ill at ease in his presence. But it usually didn't matter. Whatever job he held back then required him to travel frequently, and he was gone for long stretches of time. Since Ava was lonely and tied down with a young child, she used to come around my house frequently, carrying Brahm, and over time we became good friends. My opinion of John was not unjustified. When he was home, he became surly, and sometimes he drank heavily. There were several times when Ava came knocking at my door at odd hours, carrying Brahm and asking me if she could hide in my house for a while. Of course I always let her, and of course sometimes John came knocking as well, often drunk, and asking me if I knew where Ava was. Naturally, I always lied to him and told him that I didn't. It was more than a bit unnerving, hoping that Brahm wouldn't make any noise while John was at the door. It was as though I was hiding Ava from the authorities, like she was Anne Frank, holed up in some secret annex in Amsterdam. One horrible evening, Ava came to me, carrying Brahm, and she was terrified. John was threatening to kill her, and not for the first time. He'd done it often. He'd even written letters to her while he was away on business, threatening to kill her, and to kill me as well. It was 1981, not long after John Lennon had been murdered, and in one letter he referred to me as Jim Lennon. When Ava showed me that letter, it gave me chills. Of course it did. I knew that John owned a gun. It was very late when I piled Ava, Brahm, and her hurriedly packed suitcases into my old '73 VW Super Beetle. She asked me to drive her to Chicago, where she had a Dutch friend who'd also married an American. Before we left town, we searched in vain for her dog Vampy, who'd run off during the argument she'd had earlier with John. Fortunately, John had run off as well, but of course we were both terrified that he'd return at any minute while we were looking for her dog. Vampy was big and shaggy, and I don't know where the hell we'd have put him in that little Volkswagen if we had found him. Finally, we decided to leave, still fearful that John would find us if we didn't. I promised Ava that I'd keep looking for Vampy when I got back. I kept my promise, but I never found him. We drove all night to Chicago, and I left Ava and Brahm at the tiny apartment of her friend, where she was consigned to sleep on a couch with Brahm on the floor next to her. Her friend's husband resented Ava's and Brahm's presence, and it wasn't long before she fled again, this time to Texas, to some American friends of a friend. I can't remember who they were, and I don't want to. After a few weeks she was back in St. Charles. She and John were trying to reconcile. By then I'd moved out of the old house I was renting, back across the Missouri River to a condo that was closer to the St. Louis airport and my job at McDonnell Douglas. A couple of friends who were renting it were looking for another roommate, so I jumped at the chance to join them. Ava came to see me fairly often, but I never went back to St. Charles to visit her. I had no desire to cross paths with John. Ava told me that while she was in Texas, the American couple she was staying with had offered to let her and Brahm live with them permanently, but only if she'd accept Jesus Christ as her Lord and Savior. The poor deluded fools, I remember thinking. They thought that they were doing her a favor. They thought that they were going to save her soul. What she told me about them angered me. I've always hated kindness and compassion that came with conditions. Of course, Ava's attempt to reconcile with John failed, and one afternoon she called to ask if she could stay with me for a while. And of course I told her that she could, but I wanted to make sure that it was fine with my roommates as well. They didn't mind, they said, but I could tell that they were a bit spooked by the idea of a woman and her baby staying with me on an open-ended visit. Ava and I slept in the same bed with Brahm between us so that he wouldn't fall onto the floor. Ava and I were never anything more than just friends, but of course more than once I thought about turning our friendship into a romance. I was, after all, a 27-year-old single guy, and Ava, who was a few years older, was an attractive woman and a fine artist, and I cared for her deeply. But I knew how emotionally fragile she was, and for once in my life I did the sensible thing, and I kept our relationship as uncomplicated and as genuine as I could. It was yet another road not taken moment that I've come to regret, because I can't help but wonder now what might have happened to Ava and Brom had she and I started a romantic relationship when we had the chance. By the time Ava and Brom took up residence with me, I was traveling a lot, mostly to Maynard, Massachusetts, which was the headquarters of what was then the Digital Equipment Corporation. DEC built many of the computers that we used on our missile project, and I was sent to classes there in preparation for my move to Germany. Once when I came home after a 2-week class, Ava and Brom were gone. The awkwardness of living with my roommates in my absence bothered her, and she decided to go back to Texas, to the family that wanted to save her soul. It's a bit ironic to think that she fashioned some kind of a Faustian bargain with them, but I can only imagine that that's what she did. When I returned from another trip to Maynard, an anguished letter from Ava was waiting for me. She'd written from Texas, and she said that John was stalking her and that he was threatening again to kill her and to kill Brom. Could I please call her, she wrote, and then she gave me the phone number where she was staying. I immediately dialed it, but the people who answered had never heard of Ava. She'd given me the wrong number, I thought, so I resolved to write her a letter and ask her for the correct number. I never got the chance. A few days later, I received another letter, this time from one of Ava's Dutch friends. I can no longer remember who. I may still have the letter somewhere, but I know that I can never look at it again. But I can never forget the words in it that made me freeze. Last week Ava stepped out of life, the letter said, taking Brom with her. I grabbed Ava's letter again and I looked at the phone number she'd written. This time I saw a different number. There was a little curly Q2 that I'd misread as a 7 or something like that. I dialed the corrected number and I reached someone in the Texas house where Ava had been staying. Yes, the person said Ava was dead, and so was Brom. Ava had found a gun that was kept in the house, because of course her Texas host had a gun. In a moment of deep despair that I will never be able to comprehend, Ava used that gun to shoot Brom, and then to shoot herself. It still pierces my heart trying to imagine how Ava, who was so kind and gentle, could have been driven to such a terrible, dark place that she could commit such a horrific act as that. And I still think often about how, if my friendship with her had taken place in the current century, we would have been in constant contact, and that perhaps I would have been able to help her. What if I had simply read that phone number correctly the first time I saw it? I also can't help but think about Ava's own road not taken moments. What if she and I had started a romantic relationship and she'd moved to Germany with me? Even if that part of our relationship hadn't survived, she and her son probably would have. Brom would be in his early 40s now. Ava and I would most certainly still be friends, lifelong friends. And what if Ava hadn't met an American in Nepal? Would a gun and the threat of gun violence have driven her to shoot her own child and then herself? If she hadn't found that damned gun when she did, in that house in Texas, she might have gotten past the moment of terrible darkness that ended her life, and that ended the life of her son. There were others. I'm not going to write about any of them here, other than to say that I was a pallbearer at the funeral of one. Some of them were close friends, and all of them were the close relatives of people who have appeared in this book. But I'm not going to write anything about what happened to them and to the people they loved. Those were their stories to tell, not mine. There's a common thread that runs through all the horrible stories of all the people I've ever known who have been affected by gun violence. In every case, the lives of my friends were ended, or ruined, or forever altered by the use of a gun that was kept in their house for protection. In the interminable American debate about gun control and gun rights, most people ignored the fact that their families are far more likely to be injured or killed by their own guns than they are to be successfully defended by those guns. A Harvard study in 2008 noted that, in the United States, suicides outnumber homicides almost 2-to-1. Research shows that whether attempters live or die depends in large part on the ready availability of highly lethal means, especially firearms. The exponential proliferation of American gun ownership in the years that followed the Harvard study has only made matters far worse. The notion that a family is made safer by the presence of a gun in their house is a popular delusion. And all too often, it becomes a tragic delusion. After 8664 was buried under the pilings of a new bridge, I decided that I'd had enough of political campaigns. They were too exhausting, and tedious, and expensive. The only real cause that I had left over from my campaign was health care reform and the defense of the ACA, which of course I had a vested interest in, and which of course Republicans were hell-bent to repeal. And of course the Republican who was leading the hell-bent charge to repeal the ACA was none other than Mitch McConnell. I need some advice, I told my lawyer friends Karen and Julie once while we were all standing around a fire pit in Karen's backyard. I trusted them because they'd both signed up to volunteer for me after the Mastersons debate, even though I'd said that I'd wanted to kill them. I'm afraid that if I see Mitch at Kroger, I'm going to have to hit him. I'm at least going to be tempted to chuck a cantaloupe in his direction, like a shot put. I don't advocate violence, but what happens if I do something dumb and impulsive? What if I get lucky and I beat him with the cantaloupe? What happens then? I asked them. We don't advocate violence either, they both said, but if you do something dumb, call us before the cops show up. That way we can spring you on bail the same day. Otherwise, you're probably going to have to spend the night in lockup. Good to know, I told them, although of course I hoped that it was info I'd never need. And of course I was joking with my lawyer friends while standing around their fire pit, but a few months later, when I finally had a close encounter of the Mitch kind, I was still relieved that I didn't need their advice. Ironically, Mitch McConnell's official residence is a reasonably unassuming townhouse that sits near the southern edge of the hippy-dippy highlands in Louisville. It's only about a half-mile from the Bambi Bar, and Bambi walkers need only take a short detour to see his Louisville crib if they want to. It's also an easy walk from our place. I can see Mitch from my house. Although Mitch is a multi-millionaire and probably a billionaire if we throw in all the dough that his wife Elaine Chow's family has, his place is not at all ostentatious. And to his credit, he actually inhabits it fairly often. There are frequent Mitch sightings at the local Kroger grocery store that I mentioned to my lawyer friends, and at Havana Rumba, a Cuban restaurant in the Highlands that's a favorite of Mitch's. Both are places that he can easily walk to. Mitch's home address is well known to Democrats in town, and whenever they get riled up enough about his latest act of treachery, they show up at his residence to bang on pots, chant slogans, and occasionally to TP his lawn if they can get away with it. Once during the pandemic, there was a bit of a ruckus when somebody spray-painted some graffiti on his door and a window. Mitch had just blocked a bill that would have issued $2,000 pandemic stimulus checks. "Where's my money?" the graffiti said. "Mitch kills the poor." He wasn't home at the time, but of course he and his Republican colleagues howled about the heinous act. "Vandalism and the politics of fear," he said. "Toxic playbook. Radical tantrum." Less than 2 years later, a crazed man invaded Nancy Pelosi's house and attacked her husband with a hammer. I never ran into Mitch at either the grocery store or the restaurant, but a lot of my friends did. In spite of their political differences, some of them proudly took selfies with Mitch, and they posted them on Facebook and Instagram. It always nauseated me whenever they did that. Others hassled the hell out of Mitch, and more than once he's had to order a quick doggy bag and flee a restaurant when he was ambushed while dining out. I admit that I had to chuckle whenever I read about stunts like that, even though I don't approve of them. Doxing is dangerous, and interrupting somebody's meal might feel good, but it isn't an effective way to bring about real change. The ACA encouraged states to develop their own healthcare exchanges, and Kentucky created one of the better ones, maybe even the best one. Steve Beshear, who was then the governor of Kentucky, created an exchange called Connect, and it was excellent. The New York Times often sang its praises, and its writers pointed to Connect as an example of how, with effective implementation, the ACA could provide real health care benefits to the masses. It was spectacularly successful in Kentucky, and the rate of uninsured Kentuckians dropped from 25% when the ACA was passed to less than 6% just before the pandemic hit. It benefited small businesses like ours as well by providing us with lower-cost premiums for our employees. Kentuckians discovered that they loved Connect. But they hated Obamacare because Republicans told them that they should. Few of them realized that Connect and Obamacare were, in essence, the same thing. It was an extraordinary popular delusion. And it was a delusion that was propagated by a deluded soul named Mitch McConnell. In 2014, Mitch was up for re-election, and by early 2013, some notable Democrats were already making noise about challenging him. Ashley Judd teased a run, and some early polls showed that she'd give him a better run for his money than most candidates he'd faced. A lot of people really didn't like Mitch. In fact, a lot of people hated him. Not as much as my friend and his old schoolmate Terry McCoy did, but a strong distaste for Mitch could be found throughout the Commonwealth. At the same time, almost everyone liked Ashley Judd, whose fame, pleasant demeanor, coal country upbringing, and love of University of Kentucky basketball endeared her even to those who weren't aligned with her politics. In February of 2013, McConnell and his minions held an early Oppo research meeting. The group focused on the two likeliest of Mitt's potential Democratic opponents, Judd and Allison Lundergan Grimes, who was the Kentucky Secretary of State as well as the daughter of Jerry Lundergan, the bloviated, blowhard friend of Bubba's who'd bored the hell out of us at the Democratic rally in Louisville where Barack Obama spoke in 2006. Some liberal activists got wind of Mitch's meeting, so they snuck into the building where it was being held, and they recorded the proceedings through an air vent. In late March of 2013, Ashley wisely chose not to run. She knew as well as we all did that running against McConnell was a guarantee that every bit of one's dirty laundry would be aired in public, and that every dumb mistake one had ever made would become the subject of a negative campaign ad. It's what Mitch always did. Despite Ashley's withdrawal, one of the Democratic operatives who'd recorded McConnell's Oppo meeting decided to turn his stuff over to David Korn, the editor of Mother Jones. Korn published the recording along with a full transcript in early April. Naturally, Mitch's camp howled in protest. "This is illegal," they said. "We're calling the DOJ and the FBI. This liberal espionage must be punished." It wasn't long before the operative was outed, and the operative turned out to be my buddy and neighbor, Curtis Morrison. Oi. Suddenly he didn't need a husband so much as he needed a lawyer. I hadn't seen much of Curtis since the end of Tyler Allen's mayoral campaign. As so often happens once elections are over, we'd headed in our own directions. Because he was my neighbor, Curtis and I would occasionally meet for a beer and a gab fest, but I had no idea that he was actively working to torpedo Mitch's re-election campaign. Shortly after the Mother Jones story appeared, Curtis' name started popping up everywhere. Salon, the New York Times, Politico, Slate, the Daily Beast, the Washington Post. I saw him on the TV. He looked scared. He should be scared, I remember thinking. He'd just poked a grizzly bear with a pretty big stick. Before long, I got a legal defense fundraising email from Curtis. He'd fled to California, where he'd hoped to get his long-coveted law degree from Whittier College, alma mater of Richard Nixon. But first, he said he needed money to keep his ass out of jail. "Damn it, Curtis," I wrote back to him, "don't you owe me money already?" He did, in fact, owe me a few bucks, but I didn't really care about that. I just wanted to chide him for being a bonehead and riling up a beast that could easily have eaten him for lunch. I wasn't alone. A lot of Democrats, including John Yarmouth, beat up on Curtis for his boneheadedness. The FBI did eventually investigate Curtis, but good law school hopeful that he was, Curtis had the good sense to cooperate with them completely. He turned over all his electronic devices. He fessed up to what he'd done. In May of 2013, he even wrote his own article in Salon titled, "Why I Secretly Recorded Mitch McConnell." Not long after that, the FBI gave Curtis all of his electronics back, which was a pretty good sign that they weren't going to pursue a case against him. The story quickly faded, as stories like these always do. Allison Lundergan Grimes crushed some token opposition in the Kentucky Senate Democratic primary of 2014. She had enough name recognition and street cred that some pundits were naive enough to think that she might even be the one to finally knock Mitch off his perch. But when it came time to face down Kentucky's senior senator, she withered like an old dandelion. Naturally, Connect and Obamacare were major topics of discussion in 2014, and Allison vigorously defended them. By them, I mean Connect. Grimes rarely used the term Obamacare, and she did her best to avoid uttering the O word at all. She couldn't even bring herself to admit that she'd voted for the man. It was as though she was trying to hide from Kentucky voters the fact that she was even a Democrat. She ran her campaign like the people who invite you to a marketing opportunity meeting, only in the end you find out that it's Amway. Meanwhile, Mitch was running around Kentucky crowing about how he was going to tear Obamacare out of the ground like it was some kind of a tree. Root and branch, he said, only in Mitch speak, so that he spoke those words slowly and deliberately, as though each one of them was its own sentence. Root and branch. It was obvious that he enjoyed saying that way, and it used to piss me off. It bugged me almost as much as his standard climate change answer. Whenever he was challenged on the subject, he'd just croak in his syrupy original Alabama accent, "I'm not a scientist." One day, Mitch stepped in his own doo-doo while being interviewed by a gaggle of Louisville journalists. After drawling again about roots and branches, he was asked directly if he wanted to dismantle Connect. "I think that's unconnected to my comments about the overall question," Mitch said, which has to be one of the dumbest answers he's ever given in a long career of giving dumb answers. Naturally, the journalist pounced. "Don't you realize that we're talking about the same thing?" they pressed him, and then one of them, a Louisville TV guy named Joe Arnold, challenged Mitch to defend his dumbness about Connect and Connections on a local show that Arnold hosted. Okay, Mitch said, but of course he'd only do so through a proxy. He offered up Josh Holmes, who was McConnell's longtime D.C. chief of staff as well as his campaign manager. But by then the Grimes campaign was in full-on chicken shit mode, and they decided that they didn't want to send anybody. And that was when I got a call from Stephen George. "How'd you like to be on TV?" Stephen asked me. By then he'd progressed from being editor-in-chief at Leo to working alongside Brooke Pardue in John Yarmouth's Louisville office. In between, he'd been editor-in-chief of the Nashville City paper, a sister publication of Leo's after it was acquired by a media holding company. And then he'd served on the staff of one of Tennessee's few Democrats in the Congress, Jim Cooper. It had been a lot of fun to watch Stephen's career progression since he first wandered into my office in 2006. But now he was working for Kentucky's only Democrat in Congress, and he decided that they needed an attack dog to take a bite out of Mitch for his dumb shit comments about Connect. I was thrilled that he picked me to be the Democrats' Doberman, and I was more than happy to oblige. By 2014, I'd learned, by necessity, more than I ever wanted to know about the U.S. healthcare system. Besides living with an incurable pre-existing condition, as a small business owner I'd had to navigate the intricacies of dozens of healthcare policies, both on and off the ACA exchanges. There were group plans, and gold plans, and silver, and bronze. There were legacy plans, which Carolyn decided to stay on because she was young and healthy. Before the ACA, we'd both had plans with Anthem, and although she'd decided to stay with hers, I'd abandoned mine and gone with a Connect plan. It offered me lower premiums, plus the promise that I wouldn't be booted or denied coverage for having a pre-existing condition. But then the healthcare plan I was on went bankrupt because it was woefully underfunded. Naturally, when the ACA became a reality, tons of uninsured and very sick Americans signed up for health insurance. The surge of people in need of serious care overburdened a lot of healthcare exchanges, and they tanked under the financial pressure. Republicans loved it. "See," they said, "this whole Obamacare thing is an expensive fraud." But it was a fraud that they perpetrated because they refused to adequately fund it. The idea that Obamacare was a disaster was a popular delusion that they encouraged everyone to believe. I went from one healthcare policy to another. I kept getting chased away because each plan I was on eventually succumbed to the pressures of insuring the very sick. Finally, I asked Anthem if they would take me back under my old pre-Obamacare legacy plan. "No," they told me, "you're dumb and ugly and you have leukemia. We're not going to insure you anymore," they said. "And if you challenge our decision, maybe we're going to have to review the legacy plan that your lovely wife is on as well." I know that I still have that letter in a box somewhere. In 2014, my primary care physician was a guy named Sven Johnson. I loved Sven. He was originally from South Africa, and he was a serious kayaker and granola as hell. He was buddies with Caldwell Esselstyn, the Cleveland Clinic physician who'd written Forks Over Knives and Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease, the revolutionary, scientifically proven, nutrition-based cure. After Bill Clinton blew out his heart, he adopted Esselstyn's diets, and doing so probably saved Bubba's life. Clinton men tended to die very young, and now Bill had managed to outlive them all. Sven kept extolling the virtues of Esselstyn's methods, and while I had to admit that he was on to something, I told him that his diets were a bridge too far for me. "Esselstyn wants us to squeeze every possible ounce of fat out of our diets." "No hummus?" I asked Sven, "because it has tahini in it? Come on." I told Sven the old joke. I knew a guy who gave up sex, drugs, alcohol, fatty foods, and cigarettes, and he was healthy as hell, right up until the day he killed himself. "You told me that joke last year," Sven would always say, and then I'd answer that, yep, I had, and that I was going to tell it to him again next year. But of course Sven and his buddy Caldwell were right. We Americans are doing it all wrong, and it's killing us. We have become a nation of fat-assed fools, yet we delude ourselves into thinking that we're not. In March of 2014, the New York Times wrote a profile of Sven in an article about the ACA. When I first got to know Sven, he was an indie, running his own practice in suburban Louisville. I'd chosen him because at the time he also conducted FAA medical exams for pilots. By the time he was profiled in the New York Times, Sven had abandoned his own practice and become an employee of Baptist Health, one of the largest healthcare networks in the Louisville area. He'd moved to Taylorsville, a small town about 30 miles southeast of Louisville, and his life had become much simpler. Because he was trying to grow his practice, he was accepting dozens of newly insured ACA patients, and the New York Times ran through a list of them, and then it described how his professional life had changed for the better. After I read the article, I remarked to Sven that it had to be nice, being an employee instead of a business owner. It was, he said. Baptist Health provided him with resources that he could never have afforded on his own. But they couldn't provide him with everything. During one visit with Sven, I complained to him about some leg pain that I was having, and he suggested that he take an X-ray. I agreed, even though I didn't want one. Although I was an asymptomatic stage 0 leukemia patient, the psychological burden of living with the disease was tough sometimes, and it caused a bit of low-level paranoia. About once a year I'd develop a symptom of some kind, and it didn't take me long to decide that I'd begun the process of dying. Sites like WebMD should probably be banned, I've always thought, because you can fly to their pages with any kind of symptom of any kind, and within a few paragraphs they'll have you convinced that you've got less than 6 weeks to live. Combine their pessimistic conjecture with what is admittedly a serious disease, and it's easy to become a hopeless fatalist. Sven took his X-ray and saw something that concerned him, so he decided to refer me to a specialist. It's probably nothing, he said, maybe just an artifact, but let's make sure. I arrived at the specialist to discover that they hadn't received the X-ray image, so they wanted to take another one. No way, I said. I'll just call Sven's office and get them to send you the one they already took. I can't do that, Sven's nurse told me on the phone. I can mail you a CD if you want. She was trying to be helpful. I was incredulous. God damn it, Sven, I bitched to him later. Think of the irony. Tonight your nurse is probably going to go home and stream a movie on Netflix, and she can't even email me a fucking X-ray? I know, it's awful, he said sympathetically, but there was nothing that he could do. My frustration with the specialist didn't end with the X-ray. We don't take Obamacare, an office clerk told me while I was standing at their check-in desk. What you just said doesn't make any sense, I told her back. There is no insurance policy called Obamacare. It's just the mechanism under which ACA policies are issued, I tried to explain. Her face shriveled into a frown of non-comprehension. I might just as well have been speaking to her in Martian. She only knew what she'd been told, that Obamacare was a bad thing. The specialist visit ended up costing me $2,000 out of my own pocket. Radioactive dyes and all that. Even now, after all the wrangling about hidden fees and electronic records, all too often we're still told, I don't know, whenever we ask what a procedure will cost. And we get another I don't know when we ask who does know. And I don't know is the only answer I get whenever I ask why medical records sometimes still have to be transmitted from one office to another by fax machines. I used to have a fax machine, I'll tell a sympathetic voice on the other end of the phone. But then the 19th century called and they wanted their technology back, so I packed it up in a crate and I sent it to them. But I do still have a carrier pigeon. That last joke is always lost on them. Invariably, they're too young to know what the hell a carrier pigeon even is. Stephen coached me with some talking points in prep for my TV battle with Josh Holmes. Keep your personal professional experience at the forefront. It gives you a huge edge over a DC guy talking remotely about policy. Mitch is trying to make a technical argument that Connect could remain if ACA is repealed, and Holmes will make the same argument. But that isn't really the question. The question is, what happens to the 415,000 Kentuckians who gained health care coverage through Connect if the ACA is repealed? The answer is simple. They lose their coverage, because without the ACA, Connect is just a website. And indeed, that was the point. I tried to conjure up a clever soundbite phrase to drive it home, like I'd done on KET. Cold dead fingers and remote controls. Something like that. I thought about using the lyrics from Lou Reed's song Dirty Boulevard. Give me you're hungry, you're tired, you're poor, and I'll piss on 'em. That's what the statue of bigotry says. Your poor huddled masses, let's club 'em to death and get it over with and just dump 'em on the boulevard. There's a scene in Michael Moore's Sicko where almost exactly that happens. An old woman is literally dumped on a sidewalk in front of the Union Rescue Mission in Los Angeles after she'd been booted from a Kaiser Permanente hospital because she had no insurance. Since I'm no good at remembering song lyrics, I decided to go with a simpler soundbite. Obamacare's the building and Connect is just the entrance, I was going to say. When we arrived at the WHAS TV studio, I was relieved to see that we were going to be sitting. Joe Arnold's set was arranged like a parlor, with the three of us in padded chairs around a coffee table. There was a sliding glass door that led to nowhere and a big wavy American flag thingy for a background. The studio wasn't at all suffocating, and I felt relaxed and confident. Joe had pages of notes with him, and he did a great job of directing the discussion. At least I seem to remember that he did. I can no longer recall what the hell any of us said. Nevertheless, when it was over, I felt great. Stephen George said that I did great, even though I think that he was being a little kind, because Stephen is a kind human being. I do remember that when I watched the recording, I saw that all of my verbal torpedoes just bounced harmlessly off Josh Holmes' titanium hull. He was the consummate DC policy wonk, and there was no way that I was going to inflict any real damage on him or his dopey boss, no matter what kinds of dopey things they said. Nevertheless, I left the studio pumped full of adrenaline, just like I'd been after the Mastersons debate all those years ago. For a few minutes, it felt good to be back in the game. None of it mattered, of course. On November 4th, 2014, Allison got clobbered by Mitch, 56-41. It would have been worse, but a libertarian named David Patterson stole enough votes for Mitch to keep him from hitting 60. I felt a little bad for Allison, given her poor showing, and I wondered if in hindsight she'd regretted running her campaign like she was some kind of an Amway marketing rep. I resolved that if I ever ran into her, I'd ask her, but I never did. The TV debate stirred something in me. It made me want to get back in the fight. There's just something addictive about the rush of adrenaline politics can bring, even if campaigns are a pain in the ass. Doing battle with Titanium Josh, or T-1000 Holmes, or whatever he was, made me want to do something again. I remember that when Carolyn and I left the WHAS TV studio, there was a young woman waiting for Holmes. She was well-dressed and graceful and somber. She was clutching an expensive-looking leather portfolio under her arm. I couldn't help but watch her and Holmes as they left the building. They just walked away quietly. They were the minions of the most powerful Republican in the U.S. government, I remember thinking, and they were working to kill the Affordable Care Act. They were quiet assassins. They were the face of the enemy. I resolved that I was going to get in front of their boss. Not at a grocery store or a restaurant, but somewhere. I didn't know where, and I didn't know what I'd say to him when I got there. Maybe I'd tell him how much my buddy Terry hated him, and that Terry said that even as a little kid, Mitch was a mean, nasty, self-serving son of a bitch. Maybe I'd tell him that killing Obamacare would also kill people like me. Or maybe I was just going to tell him what guns had done to my friends. Until my 2014 battle with Holmes, I hadn't done much of anything since the death of 8664, except for a single afternoon in Columbus, Ohio during Obama's re-election campaign. I didn't volunteer because I had very little time. We were very busy at work, and I just happened to be in Columbus on a business trip in the fall of 2012. My old buddy Joe DeCola was there, doing what we'd done together in 2008, but I only saw him once, when my cousin Susan and I had lunch with him. We had fun, but I regretted that we couldn't spend more time together. I loved the guy. For the 2012 general election, Ohio's Franklin County Board of Elections had rented a vacant Kohl's department store on the north side of town to use as an early voting center. They paid $75,000 to rent the expansive retail space for 3 months, and it was worth it, they said, because they needed a lot of room. In 2008, nearly 250,000 people voted early in Franklin County, and about 52,000 of them did so in person at early voting centers. The remainder did so by mail. The Board of Elections issued a press release. We believe most voters will find this year's site on Morse Road convenient. It's a short drive from I-71 and has parking large enough for a shopping center, said Board of Elections Director Bill Anthony. Deputy Director Dana Walsh reminded voters that they'll also have the option of voting absentee by mail. The Secretary of State will mail absentee applications to all registered voters shortly after Labor Day. No one will have to drive to a polling place or stand in line if they vote by mail. On my one free afternoon, I decided to go see the Franklin County Early Voting Center for myself. The abandoned Kohl's sat in an aging shopping center on the north side of town just east of I-71 and not far from the office on the other side of I-71 where I'd worked for Obama in 2008. When I arrived, I found a large encampment of proselytizers and protesters hanging out in the sprawling parking lot. They'd been warned to stay at least 100 feet from the entrance to the voting center. I decided to talk to a few of them while filming our interviews on my phone, Jordan Klepper style. But this was 2012, before there even was a Jordan Klepper. The day was very cold and breezy, and most of the campers were bundled inside heavy coats. The first one I approached was a 50-something's white guy in a baseball cap who was tending a panel truck. It was plastered with red, white, and blue slogans written in giant letters. Vote character, not color. Vote godly values. I asked panel truck man what vote character, not color, meant. Ask Martin Luther King, he answered. He's the one who wrote it. Of course, MLK had written no such thing. What he'd said in his famous speech was, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." I decided not to press the issue. I asked panel truck man what vote godly values meant, and he replied, "Whatever you hold in your heart." Fair enough, I thought, but I decided not to press that issue either. There was dog whistle racism all over this guy, and I didn't want to spend any more time with him. The next proselytizer I approached was a 30-something African-American woman who was wearing a red Mitt Romney hoodie. "Romney's a businessman," she said, "so I believe he can get us some jobs because he's worked in the private sector, not the public sector." As she spoke, she put special emphasis on the words private and public. I pointed out that Romney had been governor of Massachusetts. That was okay, she said, because 80% of his businesses were successful. I wanted to know where she'd gotten that statistic, but before I could ask her, Hoodie Lady told me that Romney's track record was better than Obama's. The president, she said, picked companies that have all gone bankrupt. I asked her if she was talking about Solyndra, the Theranos of the solar power world in those days. Solyndra managed to convince the Department of Energy to loan them $535 million because their clever inventions were going to disrupt the industry. But of course their inventions didn't disrupt anything except people's wallets, and they'd gone belly up, and so of course all of that was Obama's fault. Hoodie Lady told me that there was a whole list of companies that failed because of Barack, but that she didn't have the list. The most interesting character at the encampment was a tubby old white guy with a bushy gray goatee. He told me that he was almost 60, but he looked closer to 70. He was dressed in beige overalls, and he was wearing purple earmuffs. On the front of his van, he'd attached a sign that looked like it was printed by the same guy who decorated the panel truck. "Voter fraud," it screamed. The far side of his van was plastered with a really disgusting picture of a bloody fetus. Tubby guy was worried about dead people. There could be anywhere between 30 to 50,000 dead people who were still on the active voter rolls, he was telling me, when our conversation was interrupted by a well-dressed African-American man. He was playing Jordan Klepper too, although he was being far more direct and less patronizing than I was. Black Klepper held up his cell phone. "Dead people?" he asked Tubby Guy. "Are the dead people going to show up and vote even though they're not removed from the rolls?" Tubby Guy was nonplussed, and Black Klepper pressed his advantage. "You're making something up that's not a problem," he said. "Where's the fraud? How about the 5.3 million people with convictions that don't know if they can vote?" he wanted to know. Without answering, Tubby Guy decided to disengage and retreat to the safety of his van, and Black Klepper departed, satisfied that he'd vanquished his foe. I wandered over to Tubby Guy's van, and I found him sitting in the driver's seat, reading the daily paper's obituaries. "Look at all those dead people," I said to him. "Incredible." After we'd talked for a few minutes, a passerby started yelling at him about the disgusting dead fetus pictures on the side of his van. "Stick it up your ass," he told Tubby Guy, at which point I decided that I'd had my fill of dead people. There were more disgusting fetus pictures, and some of them were being carried around by 3 30-something white guys who were standing near the shopping center's entrance. "Obama's choice," their posters said, written above a photo of a hand holding a small bloody fetus. The posters were only really visible to people who were headed to Kroger instead of the voting center. I asked them what kind of reactions they were getting from people who were just going to buy groceries. Most of them were offended, one guy said, but abortion is offensive. When I asked them the standard rape or incest question, they all agreed that no exceptions could be made for anything like that, because white guys know best. I spotted a couple of Dutch journalists. They were doing a tour of swing states, and they just arrived from Florida. I asked them which state was the most interesting. Definitely Ohio, they said, because the race was so close there. While I was gabbing with them, a 20-something kid joined us. He was a reporter for GQ magazine, he said, and he was writing an article that would appear in GQ's November 5th edition, the day before the election. "The most important voters in the most important state in the most important presidential election" would be his headline. The kid told me that his name was John Thompson, and he was a native of Columbus, so it made sense for the magazine to dispatch him to Ohio. Eventually, I got around to reading his article, and in his intro he wrote, "To really get Ohio, you need a native Ohioan, and I am GQ's native Ohioan." He went on to pay homage to Dwight Eisenhower's highways. "Thanks to the interstate highway system, there's an easy way to get a cross-sectional tour of the state. I-71 runs like a seam from the industrial Northeast through the central flatlands to the Ohio River, and I planned to drive it from one end to the other in hopes of assembling an impossible collage. While I was trying to figure out what an impossible collage was, I saw that he'd written a paragraph about me. By the time I got to the Franklin County Early Voting Center, it was near dusk. I ate a ham sandwich for a very Ohioan dinner, and I watched a busload of Ohio State students arrive just before the polls closed while chatting up a gray-haired man in a leather hat named Jim Moore. He told me he was visiting from Montreal, where he and his French-Canadian wife lived. He once ran for Congress in Louisville, Kentucky, on the sole platform of legalizing weed, and he told me how it was unbelievable, the adrenaline rush of standing at a podium in front of 800 people. Jim made me happy. He reminded me of the agreeable weirdos and art kids who populated the grimy bars where I listened to local post-rock bands that made adolescence in Ohio a little more bearable. After I read his article, I spent a few minutes trying to convince myself that I was an art kid, but I couldn't do it. At least I'd made him happy. 5 weeks after the GQ article appeared, a 20-year-old kid in Newton, Connecticut shot his mother to death in her bed. Then he went to Sandy Hook Elementary School and murdered 6 adults and 20 children. Allison Lundergan Grimes was far from the only Democrat to get her ass kicked in 2014. Republicans regained control of the Senate for the first time since 2006, and now with majorities in both houses, they started crowing louder about how they were going to feed Obamacare into the wood chipper. Root and branch. After I duked it out with Josh Holmes, I started spending more time with Kentuckians for single-payer health care, and I joined up with Moms Demand Action, a gun control group that was formed in the aftermath of Sandy Hook. Of course, my cynical friend Adam kept calling the gun control group Moms Looking for Action, and I cursed him every time I met with the moms, because I couldn't help but think about his dopey joke, and sometimes it was hard to pay attention. The problem I ran into with both single-payer and the moms is that we did a lot of pot-banging and slogan chanting, but very little else. John Yarmouth was already an active proponent of Medicare for all as well as effective gun control measures, and of course the Republican-dominated Kentucky legislature was stridently opposed to anything of the sort. In a place like Louisville, there was no point in even trying to effect change through legislative means, which of course is the only real place that it can happen. Carolyn and I went on a gun control march only once, in late 2015, through the streets of Louisville with Adam and his wife. It was 10 days after a radicalized couple killed 14 people and wounded 23 others in San Bernardino, California. Earlier in the year, a white supremacist murdered 9 black parishioners at a church in Charleston, and revulsion against gun violence was swelling the ranks of the moms. We all wore orange shirts and hats to symbolize the "Don't Shoot Me" vests that hunters sometimes wear, unless of course they're hunting with Dick Cheney. On our march, we walked past a 20-something fat guy with a beard. He was holding an assault rifle and staring at us. Seeing him standing there, taunting us in silence, made my blood boil. He wants to exercise his Second Amendment rights? I'm going to exercise my First Amendment rights and tell that guy to fuck off, I told Carolyn, who immediately told me don't you dare, and so I didn't. But it wasn't easy to suppress my emotions, looking at that disgusting fat fuck and his stupid gun. On the 1st of March 2016, Donald Trump came to town. His Louisville visit coincided with the GOP's SEC Tuesday set of mostly southern state primaries, although Kentucky wasn't among them. Kentucky Republicans were holding a caucus later in the week. A friend asked us to go with him to see the Donald, and so we did. Our friend's name is Guillaume Coiraton, and he's a chemical engineer from Lyon, France. In 1999, Michelin dispatched him to Louisville to work as a process engineer at their plant in Rubbertown, American synthetic rubber. He eventually became the plant's manager, married an American, and he decided to stay in Louisville forever. When he and his wife Laura got married, Carolyn officiated the bilingual ceremony. It's only a bit of a stretch to say that Guillaume is an American who was accidentally born in France. He's as American a Frenchman as anyone could ever meet. Guillaume was by no means a fan of the Donald, but he happened to be buddies with one of the editors of Libération, a left-wing pinko-communist French newspaper that's widely read in the Francophone world. When the editor found out that the Donald would be visiting Louisville, she asked Guillaume to go to Trump's rally and write about his impressions. He didn't want to go alone, and we certainly couldn't blame him. By coincidence, my sister was in town visiting, and of course she was a big fan of the Donald, so I asked her to go with us. Guillaume's wife Laura decided to join us as well, and eventually our group swelled to about a half dozen. In early 2016, I knew very little about Donald Trump, except that he was an imbecile. and a misogynist, and a narcissist, and pretty much every other derogatory ist word in the English language, of which he obviously had very little command. If I'd worried about Sarah Palin being an old man's heartbeat away from the presidency in 2008, I should have been very worried about a pathetic clown like Donald Trump entering the White House in 2016. But I wasn't, and of course too many of us weren't. There was just no way, we all thought, that this buffoon could ever get elected. Trump's Louisville rally was held downtown in a convention center that held about 5,000 people. Outside, a gaggle of protesters were standing on a street corner, and a few of them held signs. My favorite one read, "Trump eats farts," so of course I took a picture of it. The chairless hall appeared to be about half full when we finally got inside. My sister wandered away from us, and I didn't see her again until we met up after the rally. What immediately impressed me about the majority of the attendees was that they were stupid. I was struck by it, by the pervasiveness of it. I couldn't ignore it. I talked briefly with a group of 3 20-somethings white guys, all dressed in patriotic gear. I can no longer remember what was said between us, but it was certainly not memorable. I can only remember that they were morons. I eavesdropped on another group of 40-something white men who were wearing tacky pro-Trump t-shirts. They were laughing and clowning around and acting like obnoxious 10-year-old boys, and whatever words I heard coming out of their mouths appalled me. They were inarticulate idiots. It's almost pointless to specify the ethnicity of the pro-Trump attendees at that rally. Naturally, they were all white. The few black people who made it inside were there to protest, of course. The brave fools. At one point, a 20-something black girl carrying an anti-Trump sign walked right in front of me. Before I could read all of what she'd written, she was set upon by a tall and muscular 20-something white guy who slapped her sign out of her hands. To her credit, she didn't say a word. She just walked away. Several protesters were roughed up, but the Louisville police did a credible job of detecting and diffusing hotspots as they happened. Nevertheless, several people filed police complaints after the rally, but of course nothing ever came of it. The atmosphere was raucous and the tension was palpable, for those of us who weren't Trump fans at least. When the Donald began speaking, he tried to stir the crowd by talking about coal, but nobody in the mostly Louisville crowd seemed to give a damn. Coal was just a thing that happened in faraway eastern Kentucky. But then he started talking about the wall. He was going to build a big, beautiful wall, he told his cheering adorers, and they roared their approval. And then he asked them the question that he knew from experience would bring them to a fever pitch. Who's going to pay for it, he wanted to know. Mexico! Mexico was going to pay for the wall, he bellowed. When he said that, the mood of the crowd shifted to a place that was more than a little scary. USA! 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 They began roaring, and most of them were pumping their fists. And that was the moment when I finally saw it. All those years ago, living in Germany, listening to Germans young and old talk about their collective guilt. How could this have happened to us, they'd ask. To us, here, in civilized, well-educated Germany. But at that Trump rally in 2016, I saw the answer. I told my German friends about it the next year when we traveled back to visit. I saw how it can happen, I told them. I saw it happen in my hometown. It can happen anywhere. When the rally was over, Guillaume shot to the front of the room to try to get a closer glimpse of the Donald. The rest of us hung back, milling around, waiting for Guillaume to rejoin us. In the media pool, I spotted Philip Bailey, who I'd known almost as long as I'd known Stephen George. Philip is a journalist who also started life as a cub reporter for Leo. By the time of the Trump rally, he was writing for the Courier-Journal. I walked up to the group of journalists, most of whom were TV guys from Louisville and Lexington. Man, I said to no one in particular, was that just like Nuremberg 36 or what? Nobody answered. They were all quiet, and most were preoccupied with packing their gear. I gabbed with Philip for a few minutes because I hadn't seen him in a while, and I showed him my Trump eats farts picture. Send me that, he said, and so I did. When we finally left the convention center, we repaired to a restaurant bar at 4th Street Live, the pedestrian area that was just a short walk away, and close to where the downtown arena could have been built. We were all a bit shell-shocked, and for a while we just sat together, talking only a little. Eventually my sister joined us, and when she did, I asked, once again to no one in particular, "Man, could you feel the hate in that room?" Only my sister replied. "Hate? What hate? I didn't see any hate." Her answer really disturbed me. We shared the same DNA, the same childhood. We lived on the same planet, but now in very different worlds. It was a moment that made me quite sad. I couldn't know it yet, but it was a moment that families all over the country were beginning to experience. Lying in bed that night, Carolyn was still very disturbed by what she'd seen, and she couldn't sleep. For years, I'd been bugging her to get her U.S. citizenship, mostly for pragmatic reasons. I argued that if I croaked before she did, which was and remains highly likely, being a U.S. citizen would make the handling of finances a little easier for her. A few weeks before the Trump rally, she'd finally completed the onerous paperwork, paid her fees, and now she was just waiting for an invitation to her final interview. But on that evening as she lay in bed, her eyes were a little misty, and she said quietly, "If this is what America is, I don't want to be an American." "What you saw today wasn't the real America," I told her. "It can't be." But privately, I was having my own moment of doubt. I didn't know what else to tell Carolyn, so we just lay there in silence, staring at the ceiling and wondering what it was that could have made that crowd so mad. Guillaume and a cadre of French citizen journalists who lived in the United States had been covering Trump's rise for over a year in publications like Libération. In one of Guillaume's earlier pieces, he offered responses to a question that he'd asked a number of friends, including me. He wanted a one-sentence answer to explain Trump's growing popularity. His article ended with this translated to English paragraph. Jay provided the finest answer, in my opinion. Trump is a reflection of the discontent, rage, and bigotry of those who feel minimized. The more cynical Jim cited George Carlin. Think of how stupid the average person is, and then realize half of them are stupider than that. In a footnote, he explained to his French audience who George Carlin was. George Carlin is an actor and author. He is best known for his dark humor, his thoughts on politics, psychology, religion, and other taboo subjects. I only noticed while writing this book that Guillaume made a minor error in his description of Carlin. By the time of the Trump rally, George had been dead for 8 years. A few days before the Kentucky Democratic presidential primary in May, Bernie Sanders came to Louisville. He held an outdoor rally at Waterfront Park beneath the curving bicycle and pedestrian ramp that led to the Big Four railroad bridge. The Big Four was an ancient bridge by American standards. It carried trains across the Ohio River from 1895 until 1968, when it fell into disuse. In 1975, the old approaches to the bridge were removed on both sides of the river, and a debate ensued as to what to do with the remaining structure. The president of Costa Rica wanted to buy it and move it there, London Bridge style, but nothing ever came of it. Some enterprising developers proposed building condos into the bridge's superstructure. That was a good idea, I remember thinking. They can build on the cheap because they'll save on bathroom plumbing. They can just launch everything straight into the Ohio River. But the condos never happened. Finally, everyone agreed that the Big Four should be converted into a bicycle and pedestrian bridge. It would become a Midwestern version of New York City's High Line, and it would connect the city of Louisville with the cities of Clarksville, Jeffersonville, and New Albany in Indiana. The new approaches were finished in 2014, and by the time of Bernie's visit, the Big Four had become wildly successful. Scores of people walked and biked across the Ohio River every day. Commerce flourished in southern Indiana, and all of its adjacent river towns were swelled with the development of new bars, restaurants, and retail spaces to handle the influx of car-free crowds from Louisville. The Big Four and its associated bicycle paths allowed Carolyn and me to ride our bikes from our house in the Highlands, through Olmsted's Cherokee Park, past Butchertown, and then across the Ohio River all the way to New Albany, 12 miles to the west, in just an hour. The Big Four has improved the quality of life for just about everyone who can access it. There was a big crowd at Bernie's rally. There were at least twice as many people as we'd seen at the Donald's event, and by the time we got to Waterfront Park, we were relegated to spots where we could only see Bernie on the big screen TVs that flanked his stage. Bernie recapped the progress of his campaign. Nobody gave us a chance, he said, but young people, 45 and under, were voting overwhelmingly for him. He started raging about income inequality. The middle class is subsidizing Walmart, Bernie said. Walmart pays its workers such a low wage that they have to apply for food stamps and welfare just to survive. It's a little bit nuts, Bernie said, when the American middle class has to subsidize the employees of the wealthiest family in this country. I couldn't help but be struck by the night and day differences between the two rallies we'd seen in the last 2 months. Bernie was offering free college tuition. The Donald wanted to wall out Mexicans. Bernie's rally was all peace and love, and the majority of the attendees didn't seem stupid. At least I wasn't taken aback by their collective Sieg Heil tendencies and lack of intellect like I'd been at the Trump rally. And then there were the personalities of the candidates. Trump's imperious, ill douchebag persona put off even a lot of the people who were voting for him, and he was about as charming as a sheet of grade triple-aught sandpaper. By contrast, even my sister had to admit that she had a soft spot for the Burn. There was no way she'd ever vote for him, but there was just something irresistible about the guy. So much so that he appealed even to a conservative like her. Candidate Bernie had an endearing personality that could sometimes soften the hearts of even the hardest of hardcore wingnuts. A month after Bernie's Louisville rally, Hillary Clinton clinched the Democratic presidential nomination. A lot of us had an odd feeling when that happened, but it was only much later that I figured out why I did. Because I'm old, I remember well the presidential primaries of 1976, when an insurgent named Ronald Reagan almost defeated the incumbent president, Gerald Ford, for the Republican nomination. It was very close, and when the dust settled, I remember that a lot of Republicans started murmuring to themselves, "We just nominated the wrong guy." On June 3, 2016, Muhammad Ali died. His funeral in Louisville would be the biggest in the nation since JFK's in 1963. His casket would be driven all over town, starting at a funeral home not far from the Serious Man neighborhood where I'd grown up and the black subdivision where fellow boxer Jimmy Ellis had lived. The funeral procession would travel north past West Buchel and then take highways to I-64, where his hearse would pause on the riverfront interstate that ran alongside the Muhammad Ali Center. After that, his hearse would tour the West End neighborhood where he'd grown up and pause in front of his boyhood home. Then it would proceed east on Broadway to Cave Hill Cemetery, where he'd be laid to rest. Carolyn and I decided to ride our bikes to the cemetery entrance, which was adjacent to a large intersection. When we arrived, we found a huge crowd in the midst of a street party. As the funeral procession crawled past us, we could see Will Smith smiling and waving from the lead limousine. Eventually, I spotted a couple of Chinese kids filming themselves with a selfie stick. I'd read about such citizen journalists. They live stream events back to their followers in China on platforms like Tencent or Weibo. Naturally, I had to get in their faces to see what they were up to. When I did, one of them asked me in slow, halting English, "Viewers want to know why everyone so happy at funeral." Well, I told them, this isn't so much of a funeral as it is a celebration of life. A funeral like John F. Kennedy's was sad because his death was shocking and sudden, I said. But everyone knew that Muhammad Ali had been very ill for a long time, and so they're happy that he's no longer suffering. Samsara, Nirvana, and all of that rot, I told the Chinese kid. "Oh, okay," he said. I thought about messing with him by telling him that the Ali family had worked a special deal with PETA and that they'd bought a slightly used burial plot for a very good price that was close to Ali's buddy, Colonel Sanders, but I decided not to bother. I'm not sure that he understood anything that I was telling him anyway. And in reality, in death as in life, the greatest is about as far away from the Colonel as he could be. The first hint of presidential trouble that we saw came when Carolyn and I were working at a New York State government office on Staten Island. It was sometime in July of 2016, and we were on a lunch break in the building's dimly lit and depressing break room. Next to us was a table full of women. One guy joined them dressed in dark gray maintenance overalls, the kind that have a little name tag thingy stitched on the breast. We weren't paying attention to their conversation until Maintenance Man bellowed, "Hillary Clinton! My wife hates that fucking bitch." Ouch. It was only one data point, but it was certainly not a good sign. There were a lot of people who just plain didn't like Hillary. It was odd, I remember thinking, because I recalled Jennifer Moore telling me how charming and genuine Hillary was. By the time of the 2016 election cycle, Jennifer had done a stint as the chair of the Kentucky Democratic Party, and she'd spent some time in private meetings with Hillary. In person, she's warm and engaging, Jennifer told me. But on stage, in front of a microphone, all too often poor Hillary came across as cold and screechy. "Michael Moore says that Trump's gonna win," said the worried voice on the phone. The voice belonged to Ingrid Scheibler, the wife of my Harvard law buddy John Coates, who'd become fascinated with Kentucky's judicial election system when he visited Louisville during Tyler's campaign in 2010. Ingrid is also an intellectual heavyweight. I'd met her while she was completing a 4-year postdoctoral fellowship in philosophy at Cambridge. Ingrid is also an incessant worrier. At least she is when it comes to her kids. Carolyn and I were with John and Ingrid when she allowed their first child out of her sight for the very first time. While we were having dinner, she let their au pair take their daughter to a playground next to our restaurant. Ingrid was jumpy and nervous the entire time, and finally we told her to just give it up and go to the playground. So she did. Ingrid had just read a blog post that Michael Moore had published in late July. "This wretched, ignorant, dangerous part-time clown and full-time sociopath is going to be our next president," Michael wrote in his opening paragraph. And then he wrote these words: "There is no doubt in my mind that if people could vote from their couch at home on their Xbox or PlayStation, Hillary would win in a landslide. But that's not how it works in America. People have to leave the house and get in line to vote. And if they live in poor, black, or Hispanic neighborhoods, they not only have a longer line to wait in, everything is being done to literally stop them from casting a ballot. So in most elections, it's hard to get even 50% to turn out to vote. And therein lies the problem for November. Who is going to have the most motivated, most inspired voters show up to vote? You know the answer to this question. Who's the candidate with the most rabid supporters? Whose crazed fans are going to be up at 5 a.m. on Election Day, kicking ass all day long, all the way until the last polling station has closed, making sure that every Tom, Dick, Harry, and Bob and Joe and Billy Bob and Billy Joe and Billy Bob Joe has cast his ballot? That's right. That's the high level of danger we're in. And don't fool yourself. No amount of compelling Hillary TV ads or outfacting him in the debates or libertarian siphoning votes away from Trump is going to stop his mojo. Don't listen to Michael, I told Ingrid. I love his films, I said to her, but he's too prone to demagoguery. This can never happen. American voters aren't that stupid. In the days leading up to the election, I half-heartedly signed up on Hillary's website and made a few dozen phone calls to swing state voters. It was all I could do because we were in Montreal. Naturally, nobody ever answered my calls, so I just left them lame off-the-cuff messages. I hated reading from the scripts that phone bankers are always given. They all sounded stilted and phony. In any event, I freely admit that my heart just wasn't in it. I felt nowhere near the same sense of urgency as I'd felt during McCain-Obama in '08. As it turned out, too many of us felt the same way. In some post-mortem discussions with Democratic friends, we tried to enumerate the reasons why. Maybe it was because we were older. Maybe it was complacency, or Clinton fatigue. Or maybe it was just because a lot of us were pissed off and disappointed at the way the Democratic Party unceremoniously shunned Bernie Sanders aside. A lot of Bernie supporters even threatened to cast revenge votes for Trump, the mad fools. If Bernie had been the candidate, there would at least have been a lot more energy on the Democratic side of the campaign. But he wasn't the candidate. We'd nominated the wrong guy. On the 8th of November 2016, we invited a bunch of Canadian friends and relatives to our Montreal place for an election night party. I bought a few bottles of champagne so that we could toast the election of the United States' first female president. I was a lousy host. I sat glued to the TV all night, and I left our guests to fend for themselves. But they all knew where the kitchen was, and that was where Carolyn and most of them stayed. I was the only American citizen present in our house, and the only one who really gave a shit about what was going on south of the border that night. Canadians were living in a really nice apartment, like Robin Williams said, and they didn't worry too much about the meth lab downstairs. But then the meth lab exploded, and it contaminated the shit out of everything. I couldn't sleep for the next 3 days. Literally, 3 days. I'm sure that I had plenty of company. We were now living in a nightmare that we couldn't wake up from because we were already awake, because we couldn't sleep, because we just allowed a wretched, ignorant, dangerous part-time clown and full-time sociopath to become president of the United States. Michael Moore had been right. In the aftermath of the election, a couple of German friends posted WTF messages on my Facebook wall, and I tried to explain to them how we'd been bitten in the ass by our horse and buggy constitution for the second time in the last 5 elections, and that this election proved that there were at least 63 million Americans who were idiots. That post prompted a pissy message from a guy I'd known for 30 years. I'd always known that he leaned conservative, but that never bothered me because he was a reasonable guy. He could never vote for Trump, he told me more than once. But just before the election, his wife reposted some stupid article on Facebook that was titled, "Why We Have to Vote for Trump." "You caved," I yelled at him. "You abandoned your principles and voted for that piece of shit, didn't you? You're an idiot just like the rest of them," I said. I was a little harsh because I was very tired and very crabby and very angry. At least 100 million other Americans were as tired and crabby and angry as I was, although at least half of them hadn't bothered to vote. It was the first argument I'd ever had with my old friend, and it was also one of the last conversations we ever had. I cursed social media. People I'd known all my life, from the days when social media meant a rotary telephone and a party line, started posting pro-Trump shit that I didn't want to see. I learned for the first time, after a lifetime of friendship, things about them that I would have rather have gone a lifetime without knowing. And once again I had plenty of company. Trump's election began the unraveling of relationships and family bonds all over the country. Whatever Trump was or wasn't, he was now the most polarizing and divisive figure in the history of the United States. "I'm fucked, Lewis," I said to my cousin on the phone. It was his daughter to whom I'd given the Ellis Island Ships Manifest all those years ago. I was fucked, I told Lewis, because now Obamacare was fucked. Its repeal was a done deal, I told him, and everybody like me with a pre-existing condition was screwed. "We can't afford to worry about people like you," the asshole in line at John Yarmouth's ACA town hall had said to me. "We were disposable," I said to Lewis, "and now we were going to be disposed of." Lewis didn't know what to say. He was a conservative, I knew that. He'd voted for Trump, I knew that too, even though we had a don't ask, don't tell policy about politics. Lewis said more than once how much he regretted the divide between us being Republicans and Democrats. But he knew that I was right about the Affordable Care Act. I could tell that it bothered him a little, but it hadn't bothered him enough to not vote for the sociopath. When the election dust settled, final FEC data showed that Hillary beat the Donald by 2,868,686 votes, yet the stupid Electoral College handed the presidency to Trump 304 to 227. In mid-December, Philip Bump wrote an article in the Washington Post that was headlined, "1.7 million people in 33 states and D.C. cast a ballot without voting in the presidential race." The article showed how in 3 critical swing states, the number of people who didn't cast a vote for president exceeded the margin of Trump's win. Maine, Florida, Michigan. In Michigan alone, the number of non-votes was more than 7 times the amount of Trump's narrow win there. Almost 129 million votes were cast in the presidential election of 2016, but if less than 125,000 people in Florida and Michigan had decided to vote for Hillary instead of leaving the presidential race blank on their ballots, she would have been elected instead of the Donald. Reading Bump's article angered me. Too many people who had a real voice in presidential politics chose not to use it, while the voices of voters in states like mine were silenced by the stupid Electoral College. A Democrat in a place like Kentucky or a Republican in a state like California might as well not bother casting a vote in a presidential election because their votes have no chance of ever being heard. But not in Michigan, and not in Florida. The Electoral College now hands presidential voting power to a select few based solely on where they live. I'm pretty sure that the Founding Fathers never thought about any of that when they were drafting the Constitution. Sometime after the election, one of the myriad political emails that I'm destined to receive for the rest of my life came from an organization called Democracy Spring. They and their partners were going to organize a protest at all 50 state capitals on December 19, 2016, the day of the Electoral College vote. They were looking for state coordinators. I was angry enough that I wanted to join them, so I applied to lead the Kentucky protest. The next morning I got an email from a guy named Tim Brown asking me to call him. I did, and after a short interview he concluded that I'd make a fine state coordinator. I was back in the game, for a few days at least. Everything about the protest happened quickly. It had to. My conversation with Tim was on the 14th of December, and they were still in the process of signing up state coordinators. The next day a flurry of emails arrived. There was a Slack channel to join, Google shared documents to read, and a contract to sign. As a state coordinator, I would be paid $700 as it turned out. I hadn't expected that. I certainly wasn't doing this for the money. Among the documents that we were asked to review was one called the December 19th Organizing Toolkit that outlined what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. The organizers admitted frankly that our actions would be a desperate Hail Mary attempt to ward off disaster, but they acknowledged that we had to try. I found myself once again a part of a desperate battle, like most of the other campaigns I'd ever been involved with. But I liked desperate battles. Among the paragraphs in the organizing toolkit were these words: We are a nonviolent campaign. A fundamental basis of unity for the December 19th campaign is a commitment to nonviolence in all of our actions. We recognize that any violation of or departure from this unity and nonviolent discipline, no matter how small, may seriously damage our movement. Thus, we understand that upholding this commitment is of utmost importance to our common strategy. We define nonviolence for the purposes of all our actions as a campaign to include the following commitments. 1. We will use no violence, verbal or physical, toward any person. 2. We will maintain an attitude of openness and respect towards all we encounter in our actions. 3. We will not destroy or damage any property. 4. We will carry no weapons or any means of physical defense, including shields. 5. We will not wear masks or otherwise conceal our faces or identities. 6. We will exercise personal and collective responsibility to ensure all participants adhere to this agreement. From the vantage point of hindsight, while writing this chapter in the summer of 2023, I couldn't help but reflect on the irony of Democracy Spring's line items about nonviolence. We were every bit as upset and angry about Trump's election in 2016 as his supporters were about his defeat in 2020. Yet we chose a far different path to channel our anger. A nonviolent path, and a path that adhered to the principles of the Constitution's First Amendment, not its Second. In all the discussions on Slack that I had with other state coordinators, and in all of our conference calls, never once did anyone even suggest that we attempt to disrupt any of the Electoral College proceedings. Doing so wasn't even on our radar because violence wasn't in our DNA. The differences between our protests on December 19, 2016 and the horrific events of January 6, 2021 could not have been more stark, and they revealed something to me that I had long suspected but that I didn't want to admit. But I found that I had no other choice. The morning of December 19, 2016 was clear and cold in Frankfort, Kentucky. Very cold. As the sun rose, it was -8 Celsius. That's 17 Fahrenheit for temperature-challenged Americans. It would get no higher than -4 Celsius or 25 Fahrenheit during the hours that we spent on the steps of the Kentucky State Capitol. I'd hurriedly filed an application to use Commonwealth facilities, and it had been approved. The application began by stating that the Finance and Administration Cabinet permits persons, organizations, or groups to use Commonwealth facilities for various purposes and events when the use will not interfere with or disrupt government functions. Of course. When the application asked me to describe the purpose of group or organization, I wrote, December 19 is a coalition of groups and citizens who want to express their concern about the election of Donald Trump. Its members are urging the Electoral College electors to defer a decision on selection of a new president to the U.S. House of Representatives. The Democracy Spring folks and their partners had furnished us with a nationwide list of all the 2016 electors, with as much contact information about each as they could find. I tried calling all 8 of the Kentucky electors, but naturally none of them ever answered. I wrote emails and snail mail letters to all of the ones for whom I had an address. I tried a quote from Alexander Hamilton's writings in the Federalist Papers that was being passed around. The process of election affords a moral certainty that the office of president will never fall to the lot of any man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications. Talents for low intrigue and the little arts of popularity may alone suffice to elevate a man to the first honors in a single state, but it will require other talents and a different kind of merit to establish him in the esteem and confidence of the whole Union, or of so considerable a portion of it as would be necessary to make him a successful candidate for the distinguished office of President of the United States. Poor myopic Al. He and the other founding fathers could never have envisioned the power of 21st century media and the ways that it would be manipulated to elevate a person with a talent for low intrigue and the little arts of popularity to become President of the United States. And, as it turned out, neither could we. I managed to cobble together a motley crew of about 75 people to assemble on the steps of the Kentucky State Capitol the morning of December 19th. Most of them came from the Louisville Metro Democratic Club. There were a few others who'd responded to social media posts I'd written. I'd asked around to see if anyone had a battery-powered megaphone, but no one did, so I brought an old-fashioned 1930s cheerleader-style cone thingy that I'd found at Target. We arrived early, and I went into the Capitol lobby to talk to the head of the Kentucky State Police security detail. "This is me and this is us," I told the state trooper, "and this is my cell number, and if you see anything that you don't like, please call me and I'll do my best to fix it." He seemed disinterested and he just nodded. I'd printed some flyers to hand out to anyone who would take them. I was hoping, of course, to get them into the hands of the electors. The flyers featured the portrait of Alexander Hamilton that adorns the U.S. $10 bill, and it contained another of his pertinent quotes. The most deadly adversaries of Republican government might naturally have been expected to make their approaches from more than one quarter, but chiefly from the desire in foreign powers to gain an improper ascendant in our councils. By the time of the Electoral College vote, we were beginning to learn a lot about Russian interference in the 2016 election, and Hamilton's quote seemed especially prescient. Hamilton would abstain, the flyers said. "Withhold your vote. Let Congress decide." We were hoping against hope that enough electors nationwide would have the good sense to recognize that Donald Trump was destined to be a terrible president, and that they'd throw the election into the House of Representatives. There, at least, even though the House was under Republican control, they'd also have the good sense to elect someone competent and sane to be president. I would have been fine with someone like former Ohio Governor John Kasich, even though he told terrible dad jokes. Anyone would have been an improvement on the Donald. On the frozen steps of the Capitol, some members of our group tried to chant slogans, but they were all too damned cold to keep it up for long. And nobody had brought any pots to bang on. A few of the women wore pink pussy hats that were becoming trendy at the time. One guy showed up with a sign that read, "Clinton is a war criminal," but he kept to himself and nobody bothered him. We didn't care what he thought, and the idea that someone might slap the sign out of his hands never occurred to any of us, because doing something stupid like that just wasn't in our nature. "I'm freezing my ass off. I'm going inside," Carolyn told me about an hour into our protest. "That's fine," I told her. "We should send a few of you inside to witness the ceremony anyway." I was sorry that I had to stay outside and tend to my flock in the freezing cold. As the Electoral College ceremony began in an ornate room in the Capitol, Carolyn told me later, Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin made a few opening remarks. Bevin was a Republican. He was also a flaming asshole. He'd succeeded the term-limited Steve Beshear, and in the gubernatorial election of 2015 he'd beaten poor old Jack Conway 53-44. At least Jack was the sitting attorney general, the only political office he'd ever hold. Only 30% of registered voters participated in the 2015 Kentucky general election. Even I'd failed to cast a ballot. We were traveling and I'd forgotten to file the requisite absentee paperwork on time. The first thing that Bevin did as governor was to shit-can Connect. Never mind that it was the flagship of all the state-run ACA healthcare exchanges. It had been created by a Democrat, so of course it had to go. All of us who had ACA policies were forced to turn to the national ACA exchange, which wasn't as good as Connect's had been. Bevin also rammed through some union-busting right-to-work legislation, laws that restricted abortion access, and he allowed the carriage of concealed handguns without a permit. He also attempted to take away Medicaid benefits from poor Kentuckians, the main feature of the ACA that I'd done battle with Josh Holmes over. Bevin also tried to reduce teachers' pensions, which of course pissed off a lot of people. In his tenure as governor, Matt Bevin gave almost everyone in Kentucky a good reason to hate him. Bevin mentioned our December 19th group in his opening remarks, and he acknowledged our right to protest. He then turned the proceedings over to Allison Lundergan Grimes, who was still the Kentucky Secretary of State and whose job it was to record the votes of the electors. She did so solemnly and with little fanfare, and by 1 o'clock that afternoon the thing was done. In Kentucky, the Donald had beaten Hillary 63-33, but of course he received all 8 of the Commonwealth's electoral votes. If Kentucky apportioned its electoral votes, Trump would have received 5 votes and Hillary 3. But she got nothing, and the voices of her Kentucky supporters were silenced. When Carolyn came outside and told me that the ceremony was over, I shouted to our group through my cheesy 1930s cheerleader cone to please go home and get warm. "Thank you for doing this," I said, "but now it's time to go." Nationwide, only 2 of the electors who were pledged to Donald Trump went faithless by voting for someone else, far short of the 37 that were needed to throw the election into the House of Representatives. We'd failed. But at least we'd tried, and from coast to coast, we'd done so peacefully. On the 16th of February 2017, Carolyn finally became a U.S. citizen. Her swearing-in ceremony was held at the Muhammad Ali Center, and she took the oath of allegiance to the United States along with hundreds of other new citizens from just about every country on earth. Guillaume was to have been among them, as he and Carolyn had filed their citizenship applications at the same time, but the immigration office misplaced his paperwork. He would become a real American a few months later. The featured speaker at Carolyn's citizenship ceremony was some lowly Mitch McConnell staffer from his Louisville office. I can't remember his name, but it doesn't matter. "Isn't it wonderful," lowly staff man said, "that our senior senator's wife is an immigrant?" "Yeah, right," I mumbled to myself when he said that. I have nothing against Elaine Chao, other than to note that she has terrible taste in men. She at least has a conscience, as she demonstrated by resigning her cabinet position as transportation secretary in the aftermath of January 6th. But to call Elaine Chao an immigrant is a bit of a stretch. Most immigrants don't arrive on U.S. soil with $1 billion in their pockets. I cursed Mitch McConnell while lowly staff man spoke, as I did almost every time I heard the senior senator's name. What I didn't know then is that 6 days later, I'd finally come face to face with the man. It didn't take Republicans long after Trump's biggest inauguration in the history of the universe to start drafting a bill that would repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. In the years since the ACA's passage, it had helped millions of Americans gain access to health care for the first time, but the ACA had been crafted by Democrats, so of course it had to go. The ACA's opponents did at least meet some stiff resistance from a lot of their constituents who were beginning to realize that health care coverage was a good thing, even if it was expensive. Getting sick without insurance, they noticed, was a hell of a lot more expensive. Republicans in Congress quickly focused their efforts on repeal of the individual mandate that required everyone to have health insurance or pay a penalty. That, they thought, was a measure that they could sell to the masses. Never mind that gutting the individual mandate would have spelled the end of most health care exchanges, which of course depended on lots of healthy people paying into their systems in order to cover the costs of those who were sick. Without the mandate, health insurance would have been just like car insurance, if only people who had lots of wrecks ever bought policies. Just after Carolyn's citizenship ceremony, chatter on social media began to surface about some protests that were being planned. It seemed that Mitch was touring around Kentucky, taking a victory lap of sorts by speaking to local Chamber of Commerce groups. He would appear at the Louisville Marriott East Hotel on February 22, 2017, to speak to a luncheon sponsored by the Jeffersontown Chamber of Commerce. Moms Demand Action decided to buy a table, and they put out a call for members to join them. I jumped at the chance. There were hundreds of protesters outside the Marriott on the day of the luncheon. The moms furnished us with orange T-shirts, and we all wore them while milling around outside the hotel with other protest groups before the chamber shindig began. But I brought a suit with me, which I kept in the car until the doors to the Marriott's banquet hall were opened. As the luncheon began, I fetched my suit from the car and I put it on in the men's room that was just outside the banquet hall. Instead of sitting with the moms, I chose a table that was close to the dais where Mitch would speak. About halfway between my table and the dais, a floor microphone had been set up for Mitch to do a Q&A session. Mitch began his remarks with a wry joke. "I have a very large fan club outside," he said. "But that's okay," he added, "because protesting is about as American as apple pie." "My hat's off to the protesters," Mitch said. "They have every right to express themselves, provided they do it peacefully. Let me suggest to you what they're protesting," he said. "They're sorry they lost the election." It was maybe the greatest understatement he'd ever made. Mitch tried to explain to the crowd how things worked in America. In this country, every 4 years, Mitch lectured us, since Washington was sworn into a second term in 1793, we've had an orderly transition of power. The losers have accepted their fate and gone out and tried to get ready for the next election and come back. That's the way it works in this country, he said. And he was right, of course. It did work that way. Until it didn't. Mitch started talking about the Republican agenda. They now owned the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. They had big plans. Among their plans, of course, was a complete repeal and replacement of Obamacare, Mitch said. I was glad that he didn't say anything about roots and branches. If he had, I'd have probably thrown one of my shoes at him. I'd forgotten to bring a cantaloupe. Mitch started whining about Democrats. They were being obstructionists, Mitch said. Hopefully people will get tired of their pointless obstruction. When he said the phrase pointless obstruction, some in the audience started to laugh. It had been, after all, only a few weeks since the nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court had expired. For 293 days, the man known as the Grim Reaper had led the effort to block Barack Obama's nomination of the very centrist and well-qualified Garland, the longest blockade in the history of the court. One of his proudest moments, Mitch had said, was when he looked Barack Obama in the eye and told him, "Mr. President, you will not fill the Supreme Court vacancy." Listening to Mitch whine about obstructionism made my blood boil. I couldn't wait to get to the microphone. I was going to tear that man a dozen new assholes. Finally, it was time for the Q&A. I bolted to the microphone, and because of my proximity, I got there first. A long line formed behind me. I was now standing in front of one of the most powerful officials in the U.S. government. Perhaps the most powerful, given that Donald Trump was a little more than a useful idiot, and Mitch was already hard at work manipulating him. But to me, Mitch was just Mitch. The guy who'd been the local county judge all those years ago. The guy my buddy Terry had beaten for junior high school student council president. The guy who Terry said had been a mean, nasty, self-serving son of a bitch ever since he was a little kid. When the moderator prompted me to speak, I told Mitch that I was from Louisville and that I'd grown up just a few miles away. I pointed in the general direction of my old Serious Man neighborhood, which was, in fact, just 4 miles from where we stood. I told the Grim Reaper that one of my good friends had gone to school with him. "He didn't really like you very much," I said to Mitch, or something like that. When I said those words, Mitch stared at me and his jaw slackened a bit. I thought about pressing that line of attack, but I decided not to. There was no point in making this thing personal, I thought, and I didn't really want to drag my buddy Terry's name into it anyway. I tacked to healthcare. I owned a small business, I told Mitch, and Obamacare had been very good to us. Mitch looked surprised. "I've never heard that before," he said. "There must be some people out there who've had a positive experience," he started to say, but then I cut him off. I told him that I could put him in touch with a lot of small business people who felt the same way as I did. That line drew a fairly enthusiastic round of applause from the crowd. I glanced at the line behind me. I wanted to stand at that microphone all afternoon and berate the Grim Reaper for his years of boneheaded obstructionism, but there were dozens of other people waiting to do the same thing. Before I left the microphone, I had to fight a powerful urge. I wanted to raise my middle finger, point it at Mitch's face, and say, "And this is for Merrick Garland." The little voice in my head was yelling, "Do it! Do it! Do it!" But then I heard Carolyn's voice. It said, "Do better," like it always did, and so I didn't do it. I would have been unceremoniously dragged out of the banquet hall. There were lots of press people in the room, and the spectacle would surely have made for an entertaining clip on the evening news and the internets. But I hadn't done it, and it wouldn't have mattered anyway. Nothing that anyone could ever say to Mitch McConnell could ever matter at all. Butadiene. By the turn of the 21st century, the use of monovinyl acetylene in the manufacture of synthetic rubber had long been abandoned. It was simply too dangerous. The volatile chemical process that destroyed the DuPont plant in Louisville's Rubbertown in 1965 was supplanted by one that used a substance known as butadiene, a gas that could be combined with catalyst to create a long-chain polymer, which was then used to manufacture synthetic rubber for tires, shoes, belts, hoses, and hundreds of other products. Synthetic rubber was not only valuable stuff, it had become essential stuff. Although much safer and easier to handle than monovinyl acetylene, butadiene is still flammable. It is also a known carcinogen, and prolonged exposure to it has been linked to an increased risk of all kinds of cancers, but especially leukemia and lymphoma. The EPA set strict standards for the allowable level of butadiene emissions, but as part of their STAR program, Louisville's Air Pollution Control Board set standards that were even stricter. If a Rubbertown plant couldn't meet the STAR targets, the plant could apply for a variance to the standards, as long as the level of emissions remained within an acceptable range, and as long as the plant could demonstrate that they were complying with industry best practices for butadiene storage and use. On May 17, 2017, the Louisville Air Pollution Control Board held a public hearing on an application from the American Synthetic Rubber Company. ASRC had found a small area outside their plant boundary in Rubbertown where the measured levels of butadiene exceeded the STAR standards by a few parts per million. The levels were still within EPA guidelines, but because they exceeded the STAR target, a permit from the Air Pollution Control Board would be needed to continue operations. But before they could approve the application, the board had to solicit comments from the general public. I saw tons of chatter on social media about the upcoming hearing. A lot of my old Democratic cronies were going to show up and berate the ASRC plant manager about his company's application, which presented me with a bit of a conundrum. The plant manager happened to be our good friend Guillaume. When we talked about the upcoming hearing, we could tell that Guillaume was a bit spooked by the specter of having to confront a room full of rabid left-wing pinko communists and environmentalists. He'd been through these things before, but this time it seemed obvious that he was in for an especially fun afternoon of Sturm und Drang. Most of the area's residents hated Rubbertown because of the way that their neighborhood smelled, even though most chemical plant emissions are colorless and odorless. But raw sewage is neither colorless nor odorless, and the Rubbertown area is also home to a giant metropolitan sewer district treatment plant. Hundreds of metric tons of human feces from all over the city flow there, every minute of every day. Somehow MSD managed to sell the local populace on the idea that their neighborhood stench was the chemical industry's fault. It was an easy delusion to sell. Synthetic rubber was a lot more valuable than human shit. Carolyn and I decided to attend the hearing to provide Guillaume with a little moral support, and his wife Laura joined us. When we arrived at the Pollution Control Board offices, the meeting room was already near capacity. Carolyn and Laura managed to find a couple of seats together near the front, but I was consigned to standing room at the very back. Guillaume was already there. He'd arrived early to set up his way cool PowerPoint presentation. He'd spent long hours working on it, which was a shame because we all knew that his beautiful slides were about to be riddled with bullet holes. I recognized most of the faces in the room. After 11 years of off-and-on political activism, I'd met just about everybody who was anybody in local Democratic politics, as well as a lot of Republicans. By 2017, I'd forgotten most of their names, but I was better at remembering faces. I looked around to see if I could spot the woman with the sad face who'd asked me about the rail cars at the Yearling Club Forum all those years ago. I tried to project what she'd look like, being 11 years older and 11 years sadder, but as best I could tell, she wasn't there. One of the names I did remember was that of a guy who I knew reasonably well. I'll just call him Randy the Radical. He and I had gotten to know one another when we both joined the Kentucky chapter of Indivisible, a nationwide organization that was formed after the 2016 election debacle. Because I was a geek, I volunteered to run Indivisible Kentucky's Slack channel, and for a while the group was very active. We held regular meetings in a nice donated space, and we spent a lot of time wailing and gnashing our teeth about the Donald and all the general injustices that were being inflicted on the downtrodden masses by Republicans. John Yarmouth even showed up once to give us an all politics is local speech, but nobody paid him much notice. They all just wanted to bitch and moan about the man in the White House. After a few months of pot-banging and slogan chanting, along with some bickering and infighting, the Kentucky group faded away. I spotted Randy sitting near the front of the EPA hearing room, and I could see that he was taking pictures of Guillaume and another ASRC executive. I decided to check Randy's Facebook page, and sure enough, he'd already posted an image of Guillaume and his ASRC colleague, along with a caption that read, "These two men are evil and racists." Jesus. The meeting hadn't started yet, so I wandered over to see Randy. "What you up to?" I asked him. "I'm doxing these two guys," he told me. I implored him to stop. "Guillaume is my friend and my neighbor," I told Randy. "He's not evil. He's not a racist. He's one of the finest human beings I've ever known." Randy didn't care. Before I could argue further, the meeting started. Guillaume gave his way cool PowerPoint presentation, and he attempted to explain the measures that ARC was engaged in to mitigate emissions from its operations. Then the floor was opened for public comments. One of the first guys who spoke said that he was an adjunct professor of something or other at the University of Louisville, founded 1798. He didn't say the 1798 part. Professor Adjunct was wearing a skirt topped with a skin-tight lime green t-shirt. He started ranting about how white men had stolen land from the Indians. I couldn't argue with his statements, since white men had in fact stolen almost the entire continent from the Indians at one point or another, but I couldn't help but wonder what the hell any of that had to do with the issuance of a variance for the emissions of butadiene. Next up was Brandon Cohen, who happened to be the Louisville Metro Council member who represented our home district in the hippy-dippy Highlands. He recited a long, rambling statement of solidarity with the residents of faraway Rubbertown, which he read while holding his laptop in one hand. I don't think that he ever mentioned butadiene either, but his diatribe was so boring that I can't really remember anything that he said. There were a few more comments. "You're killing our babies," they said. "You're killing us. You only care about profits." But nobody ever asked any questions, and nobody ever said anything about butadiene. When the meeting was over, there were tense huddles of ASRC people, tense huddles of left-wing pinko communists. Of course, Randy the Radical continued his "corporations are evil" diatribe on Facebook, so I jumped in to come to Guillaume's defense. "He's not evil," I repeated, this time in print. "He's not a racist. He's one of the finest human beings I've ever met." Then I tried to explain what the meeting was about. Butadiene, standards, variances, industry best practices. Randy and another guy decided to jump my shit. "Word salad," they said. "I hope someone is paying you to make an ass of yourself," they said. I couldn't help but reflect on the irony. I was an engineer. I was a Democrat. I had leukemia. I was trying to explain the process of regulation of a known carcinogen that causes leukemia to a bunch of left-wing pinko communist Democrats, and they were trying to tear me a new asshole for doing it. A few days after the public hearing, the variance application was approved. The communist and radical environmentalist had lost. Corporate evil had triumphed, they said. It was all about profits, they said. The entire experience disgusted me, and it left me feeling a bit dejected. I began to realize that I'd seen enough. The Star Variance meeting marked the beginning of the end of my political career, such as it had been. I managed to work on a few other campaigns that failed, but I was becoming increasingly detached from an active role in politics, and all of my efforts were pretty low-key. I'd spent enough time in a general underground abode. My political eyesight was fading, and it was getting harder and harder to see in the dark. There were other things that I wanted to do, and it was time for younger people to fight the battles that needed to be fought. Of course, I wrote a few dozen snail mail letters to swing state voters for Joe Biden in the fall of 2020, and of course I'll do it again in 2024 if I have to. The last in-person campaign I ever worked on was for a guy named Mike Breuer, a retired Marine lieutenant colonel and asparagus farmer who ran for U.S. Senate in the spring of 2020. Breuer is a great guy, and once upon a time he edited a local newspaper from his farm in Lincoln County, Kentucky, about 50 miles south of Lexington. On paper, he looked like an excellent candidate. Mike managed to gain the attention of Andrew Yang, who endorsed him in the 2020 Kentucky Democratic Senate primary. Mike was up against Amy McGrath and Charles Booker for the right to do battle with Mitch in the fall. After Andrew bailed out of the 2020 presidential race, a bunch of Yang gangers descended on Kentucky to work for Mike. They were enthusiastic as hell, but most of them are pretty clueless about the ins and outs of Kentucky politics. I knew that Mike had no chance, just like I'd had no chance. Just like Tyler Allen in 86-64 had no chance. Just like Carrie Moon and the People's Waterfront Coalition, and the December 19th Coalition, and all of the other campaigns I'd ever seen that had failed. But I admired Mike for trying. He would have made one hell of a fine senator. In the 2020 Kentucky Democratic primary for U.S. Senate, Mike Breuer finished a distant third with just 5% of the vote. The well-funded Amy McGrath edged out a surging Charles Booker 45-43. None of it mattered, of course. Of course it didn't. In the fall of 2020, Amy was predictably clobbered by Mitch 58-38. Once again, only the presence of a Libertarian candidate kept the Grim Reaper from hitting 60. A little after midnight on March 13, 2020, 7 Louisville police officers burst into the West Louisville apartment of Breonna Taylor and her boyfriend. They were looking for drugs that Taylor's ex-boyfriend had supposedly stashed there. The police were acting on a no-knock warrant which allowed them to bash down Breonna's door without announcing themselves. Whether or not they identified themselves as police officers before using their battering ram will forever remain a matter of debate. In any event, Breonna's boyfriend Kenneth Walker thought that the plainclothes officers were intruders, and after they smashed their way inside, he fired a single shot at one of them with a pistol that he kept in their apartment for protection. The officers responded with a barrage of gunfire, and Breonna Taylor was struck at least 5 times. She died where she'd stood, in her own home. And of course no drugs were ever found. Although Taylor's death immediately sparked a great deal of debate, protests didn't begin in earnest until the day after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis in May. There was and remains a lot of hand-wringing as to the reasons why. Maybe it was because George Floyd's death by suffocation was so excruciating in public, whereas there was no video record of Breonna Taylor's private death by gunfire. Or maybe, as some people noted, it was because in the eyes of too many, the life of a black woman was worth even less than that of a black man. And the life of a black anybody was worth less than the life of anybody who was white. And anybody who responded all lives mattered whenever they heard the chant Black Lives Matter just plain didn't get it. Because they didn't. By mid-May, after the death of Floyd, protests filled the streets of Louisville. For days, marches started in downtown Louisville and then proceeded south on Bardstown Road along most of the route of the Bambi Walk toward the Highlands. In the midst of the pandemic, I was alone. Carolyn had braved the gauntlet of Canadian COVID restrictions to go see her ailing mother, who was 90. Several times I wandered out of our house to walk along Bardstown Road, where I saw smashed windows covered by plywood. Night after night, National Guard helicopters flew overhead. Of course there was more gun violence. A guy named David McAtee, who was well known as the owner of a popular West Louisville restaurant called Yaya's BBQ Shack, was shot dead by National Guard troops. Someone near the restaurant had fired on police and the guardsmen, and when they returned fire, McAtee was struck and killed. David was also brandishing a gun that he kept for protection, and its visibility may have contributed to his death. When the Louisville violence started, I couldn't help but think again about the riots I'd seen as a kid. Martin Luther King's murder in '68, the busing troubles of '75, and I thought about how Louisville, like a lot of cities, was still stuck in the throes of a difficult puberty. One evening after days of protests, I watched Bardstown Road near our house fill with police cars. I had never seen so many cops in one place, not even on the streets of New York after 9/11. The cops were white and they were black. They were Hispanic and they were multiracial. They were male and they were female. And they were all young. As they sat in their cars and in the backs of their trucks, I stared at the expressions on their faces. They looked pensive and tentative, and they all looked dejected. Several protesters hurled insults at them, and a couple of times I admonished them to stop. These kids had nothing to do with the death of Breonna Taylor, I told them. Leave them alone. The protesters just glowered at me. In all of the howling discussions about the bungled police operation that killed Breonna Taylor, I also couldn't help but think about the one topic that seemed to be missing. It's not for me to second-guess Kenneth Walker's decision to open fire on people who he thought were intruders. It was the middle of the night, and he and Breonna had just been awakened by frightening noises at their front door. But the fact remains that if Kenneth had not kept a gun in their house for protection, the chances are great that Breonna Taylor would still be alive. Who painted that picture? Tyler had asked me at a party. Although he'd been to our house many times, he'd never seen the portrait of the Nepalese girl that my friend Ava had painted. Tyler had never seen the painting because for years I'd kept it hidden in our basement. I couldn't bear to look at it. But in the weeks and months that preceded that party, some horrific events prompted me to finally hang some of Ava's artwork on the walls of our living room. There was the Uvalde massacre, which of course evoked strong memories of Sandy Hook. And gun tragedies always made me think about Ava. I'm not sure why, but after Uvalde I felt compelled to rewatch Michael Moore's Bowling for Columbine. I'd seen the film a couple of times already, but one scene that I'd overlooked jumped out at me when I watched the film again. It shows a Lockheed Martin executive in a factory in Littleton, Colorado, the home of Columbine High School. The executive is standing in front of a giant intercontinental ballistic missile. Michael Moore asks him, "So, don't you think our kids say to themselves, well, gee, Dad goes off to the factory every day, and he builds missiles, these are weapons of mass destruction. What's the difference between that mass destruction and the mass destruction that's going on over at Columbine High School?" It was Michael at his demagogue best, but his words still bothered me. They made me think that maybe my own life had been little more than a series of scenes from Michael Moore movies. Bowling for Columbine also reminded me how that horrible event in 1999 shaped the mass shootings in the century that followed. How the duck and cover drills of my youth had been replaced by active shooter drills. It was the dawn of the internet age, and although social media wasn't yet a thing, the Columbine shooters quickly became infamous online. Almost every school shooter since then has craved the kind of attention that was given to the kids who murdered their classmates at Columbine. On March 27, 2023, a young transgender man shot his way into a private Christian school in Nashville. The assailant then murdered 3 9-year-old kids and 3 adults before being shot to death by police. News of gun murders is always disturbing, of course, but I found the Nashville tragedy to be especially disturbing. Among the survivors, I often feel sorriest for the mothers of the shooters in such cases. Not only have they lost a child, they have to grapple with the reality that the last act of their child's life was to inflict a horrible death on other children and horrible grief on other mothers. In the case of the Nashville murders, the shooter's mother was an active member of Anytown, the gun control advocacy group that was formed after the Sandy Hook tragedy in 2012. But the Nashville shooter's mother was also ultra-religious, and when her child announced that he intended to transition from female to male, the mother was unable to accept his decision. Her religious beliefs prevented her from loving her child as she was, and as he wanted to be. "That's not love," Guillaume said when we talked about it. And of course he was right. Love with conditions isn't love at all, and that had to be one of the factors that drove the shooter to commit the unthinkable acts that he did. The Nashville shooting made me think especially about Ava. She'd been living under the same kinds of circumstances all those years ago. The Texas family who took her in set conditions for their generosity and for their love, such as it was. I can only imagine that Ava was forced into trying to be someone who she simply wasn't, much as the Nashville shooter's mother tried to do with her child. Those constraints were only one of many factors that led Ava to commit the incomprehensible acts that she did, but the odd parallelism of the two cases is what prompted me to finally bring some of Ava's paintings out of storage and hang them on our walls. A few days after I did, I got a message from an old friend of mine, Dirk Beze. Dirk's a German who I'd gotten to know while he was working for one of our industrial clients in the U.S. Now he was the head of the company and living once again in Germany. When I got his message, he was on vacation in Scotland. "Certainly hope you were far away from it," he wrote, along with a link to a developing news story. It was about a mass shooting that was in progress at the Old National Bank in downtown Louisville, only 2 miles from our house. I started getting similar messages from other faraway friends. In the Louisville shooting, a young man who worked at the bank killed 5 of his colleagues and wounded 8 others with an assault rifle. He also wounded 2 of the responding police officers, one of them gravely, before he was shot and killed. One of the victims was a good friend of Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, who had to fight back tears during the press conference he was obligated to give. This being Louisville, another victim was a good friend of one of our good friends, someone who has appeared in this book. Another one of our close friends worked with the mother of the shooter. Against my better judgment, I listened to the frantic 911 call that the shooter's mother made in an attempt to stop her son's act of insanity. She'd been warned by his roommate, who told her that her son had left a note detailing his intentions. "I don't know what to do," the mother said to the 911 operator. "I need your help. He's never hurt anyone. He's a really good kid. He doesn't even own any guns. I don't know where he would have gotten a gun." Near the end of the call, the mother asked the operator if she should go to the bank. "No," the operator said emphatically. "I don't want you to go to the location. We have a situation that's going on down there right now, and it's dangerous. We've already had calls from other people." The mother was silent for a brief moment before she asked the operator to confirm what she'd just been told. And that brief moment of silence may well be the saddest moment of silence I've ever heard. In memory of Ava, Bram, Howard, Helen, Erica, Betty, Brianna, David, and all the victims of senseless gun violence.